Greetings. I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking and living and working on the homelands of the Onyata Aga, the Oneida Nation, the people of the Standing Stone. Osio, Palidakwadoa, Chichalagi, Natohiada Idehesti. Greetings, I'm Polly Walker of Cherokee descent and a member of the Cherokee Southwest Township in Turtle Island, known as the USA. I'm also the director of the Baker Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies at Juniata College in Pennsylvania. My work is focused on the vision of living together in balance and harmony. I'm honored to host this panel on rematriation. Many of our peoples, including the Cherokee, were matriarchal, but had that system of balance disrupted by colonialism. And Indigenous women around the world are working to restore that balance, as you will hear from the presentations from our panel members. First, before we turn to them, I invite you to travel with me to the southeastern coast of Turtle Island. It is 1759, and Atakulakula, a Cherokee chief, takes a delegation to negotiate a treaty with English colonists. In the delegation are many Cherokee women who are powerful in council and in war, and who hold governance positions that balance the power of men. However, the English delegation has no women at all, and Atakulakula expresses a concern about the intentions of the English by demanding, "Where are your women?" Atakulakula is expressing his concerns about why the British have not brought a full complement of governance to the treaty negotiations. Do they not respect the Cherokee? Contemporary disrespect for Indigenous women and their roles is a key aspect of settler colonialism, and it's being resisted by Indigenous communities around the world. As a Cheyenne Nation proverb states, a nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground. Then it is finished, no matter how brave its warriors or how strong its weapons. We turn now to scholars who are lifting the hearts of the women. First, Bernadette Muthian. She has held executive and senior management positions in academia, civil society, and the public sector in South Africa and abroad. She has over 200 publications and conference presentations, some of which have been translated from English into at least 16 other languages. She was the first Fulbright Amy Beale Fellow at Stanford University and holds postgraduate degrees in political science. She served on the Executive Council of the International Peace Research Association and was co-founder of the African Peace Research and Education Association, and for many years, co-convener of IPRA's Global Political Economy Commission. She serves on various international advisory boards, including the International Journals, Human Security Studies, and Journal of Human Security, as well as the International Institute on Peace Education. She has worked in the areas of women and peace and engendering security for over 20 years as co-founder of the Women's International Network on Gender and Human Security and Gender Egalitarian, a global Indigenous women's network. She works towards societies of compassion and positive peace, with justice and equality among all people, including women, men, and others. And I now turn it over to Bernadette.
Thank you, Polly. I am prolific in publishing, but not as prolific as Rauna, my Indigenous sister from Finland. So I will talk about rematriation, but would like to start with a poem from Nag Hammadi in Egypt, dated to some 5,000 years ago, a devotion to the great African deity Isis, whose teachings spread throughout the world, people giving her different names in different places and languages. So this is called Hymn to Isis. For I am the first and the last, I am the venerated and the despised, I am the prostitute and the saint, I am the wife and the virgin, I am the mother and the daughter, I am the arms of my mother, I am barren and my children are many, I am the married woman and the spinster, I am the woman who gives birth and she who never procreated. I'm the consolation for the pain of birth. I'm the wife and the husband, and it was my man who created me. I'm the mother of my father. I'm the sister of my husband, and he is my rejected son. Always respect me, for I am the shameful and the magnificent one. The poem was so-called discovered in 1947 in Nagamadi, Egypt. So thus our tribute to the mother of all. I'm now going to make one of 8 key points before closing, hopefully, with a poem of my own. The first point is that this is not a fairy tale. Matricentric, which just means women at the center of society, is not a myth. Our societies exist all over the world, and at root, if you look at any culture, even a patriarchal one, you will see the matricentric origins. So this isn't a fairy tale. Here we are, matricentric people. We exist, we're not extinct, we're all over the world. We live our matricentric ways, even when surrounded by patriarchy. O-word. Most mammalian life stems from a womb, from the maternal. The English word mammal is derived from the Latin mamma, or breast, and so human life springs from the womb, from the mother, mitochondrial DNA, a genetic gift from mother to daughter ad infinitum. Based on this very mitochondrial DNA, or matrilineal genes, scientists assert that all human life stems not only from the vast continent of Africa, but specifically from the semi-arid Kalahari, a desert that straddles 6 southern African countries, Angola, Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, an area that some 200,000 years ago is said to have been an oasis, literally and metaphorically. Since the onset of depredations and genocides of European colonialisms in the region, the Kalahari has been the habitat of the San people, pejoratively known as Bushmen, or people who live in the bush. San, however, merely means human, person, Homo sapien, no gender. This is where Ubuntu or Quenya comes in. I'm a person belonging to other people, a member of a community. I am because I care. I am because I belong, different to colonial individual self-interest. Quentin Atkinson, a biologist and linguist from New Zealand, who analyzes parts of words or sounds called phonemes, postulates that human language stemmed from the Kalahari San based on the proliferation of click sounds. Tracing the first human, the first woman, and language to the Kalahari San is important. The San are known to be matrilineal and matrifocal, with matricentric societies centered around the feminine. Lineage is traced from mother to daughter. This is distinct from patriarchal societies, where lineage is traced from father to son, a hierarchical society in which the feminine is reviled in favor of the phallic. By contrast with patriarchy, the San, being matricentric, has them practice social and gender egalitarianism with elected rather than hereditary leaders of any gender. Third point, chicken or egg, mater, pater, arche. The word patriarchy is derived from its Greek roots, pater and arche, which can be translated as father rule and interpreted as the rule of men over other men, women and children, the rule of men over land, seas, skies. This dominating attitude is encouraged and codified in the 3 Abrahamic monotheisms that strongly influence the constitution of the colonial mind when reading their religious texts. How can one not foresee this hierarchical devaluating pattern when the Bible explicitly states men's responsibility is to dominate the earth, women, children, slaves, animals, and other possessions? 17th century British philosopher John Locke's foundational human rights philosophy is based on this very patriarchal consciousness, especially in justifying colonial expropriation of native lands. Since women are the sources of all human life, we all come from a womb. The German political philosopher Heidegger Abendroth argues that women do not need to rule over others as the men who generate patriarchy feel the need to. For Günther Abendroth, the meaning of matriarchy is not to be understood as mother rule, but as mother in the beginning. Also derived from Greek roots mater and arche, but arche is interpreted in the alternative definition of in the beginning, in the principle, or even at the origin. We might further reflect on the different living postures that these 2 interpretations of patriarchy and matriarchy imply with what Heidegger or Günther Abendroth controversially suggests, and I'm quoting her, in the case of the term matriarchy, we are not obliged to follow the current male-biased interpretation of this word as signifying domination by the mothers. The Greek word arche has a double meaning. It means beginning as well as domination. Therefore, we can translate matriarchy accurately as the mothers from the beginning, or patriarchy, on the other hand, translates correctly as domination by the fathers. The word patriarchy could also be translated as the fathers from the beginning. This, nevertheless, leads to its meaning as domination by the fathers, because not having any natural right to beginning, creation of life through birth, they have to enforce it through domination. By the same token, since the mothers clearly are the beginning by their capacity to bring forth life, they have no need to enforce it by domination. In other words, this womb from where we all root, this womb from where we all root. There is a popular poster in public protests around the world that says, and I'm quoting, "I did not come from your rib, you came from my womb," alluding to the biblical Eve being fashioned by the divine from Adam's rib in the Garden of Eden. The poster deploys wit to speak truth, to describe science rather than myth. All human life stems from a womb. Given the potentials for misconception and the dichotomizing with patriarchy, I intentionally avoid the term matriarchy, instead deploying the more descriptive matricentric for societies that exist around the world to this day, despite patriarchy. These rainbows of matricentricity are visible in the blue-eyed desert Kabyle or Berbers of North Africa, the tall Dagera of West Africa, and my own matrilineal son of the Kalahari. Number 4, indigenous is not one village, Africa is not a country. Decolonization and restoration of our ancient and existing indigenous knowledge is significant given the matricentric societies that still exist across every continent, and notably in Africa. From Algeria to Zimbabwe, a literal A to Z of matricentricity still variously surviving today. Given the vastness of diversities in her stories, patriarchal colonizations, slaveries, and dispossession, the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, Article 31 iterates that 1. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity or membership in accordance with their customs and traditions. This does not impair the right of Indigenous individuals to obtain citizenship of the states in which they live. 2nd, Indigenous peoples have the right to determine the structures and to select the membership of the institutions in accordance with their own procedures. Thus, when I speak of my mother's healing herbs and her people's matricentricity, it is my chosen identity or membership in a moment, in all its heterogeneous, polymorphous polyvocality. We Indigenous speak for and define ourselves. 5th point, rematriation. For some 20 years, we Indigenous matricentric women around the world have explored the concept of rematriation. Rematriation of ancestral remains, spirituality, culture, knowledge, and natural and other resources, instead of the more patriarchally associated repatriation, simply meaning back to Mother Earth, a return to our origins, a return to life and co-creation, rather than patriarchal destruction and colonization, a reclamation of germination instead of semination. As a restorative imperative, it is most relevant to feminists in general, since we, like Native peoples, need to reclaim our feminist ancestry, our feminist spirituality, our feminist cultures, knowledges, and control over natural and other resources. We need to chart paths, strategic interventions, dreams, and realities that are not mere alternatives to heteropatriarchal capitalisms, but entirely reconfigure our cosmos, rematriate our societies. Now, thankfully, today, there are entire websites and publications devoted to rematriation, just like this very panel we're having here today. Knowledge is not individual, but collective and infinite. So I have not discovered the gold in this river to exploit. The gold has always been there, unmolested by man. So too knowledge. I am no Marie Curie. I merely share knowledge gleaned from many conversations with wise women and people everywhere. Knowledge I download during meditation, ancient wisdom that comes to me as I'm washing dishes, sometimes in languages I'm not entirely familiar with in this moment. So rematriation is a concept that others have used, especially Iroquois Barbara Ellis Mann, who attributes it to poet Susan Deercloud, as I thank my elder Barbara Mann and many others, like the Nigerian elder Ifi Amenduni, and indeed our very own Rauna Kuokkanen from Finland. The key principles of modern matriarchal studies, according to Heidegger and Habentroth, are: it is concrete rather than abstract in the world. It is not mother rule, but non-hierarchical. It is based on consensus through systems of councils that are grassroots, consultative, participatory democracy, distribution and sharing rather than accumulation and hoarding. It meets needs rather than power over. It's compassionate rather than selfish. It's radically oriented towards life rather than the patriarchal war industries and death industries, with political action always spiritual rather than the patriarchal detachment of the so-called Enlightenment. Science, politics, and spirituality are all connected. Ifi Amadiomi speaks of the necessity for feminist indigenous scholarship to be interdisciplinary and intersectional, including spirituality and indeed even prophecy. She rematriates the concept of the traditional in Africa to mean pre-colonial African cultures that are not static or delineated by rigid time breaks. This rematriated traditional is dynamic, past, present, and perhaps even future. For Amadiomi, the matricentric unit is the smallest kinship unit. Its material basis is concrete and empirical, while the material and ideological basis of patriarchy embodies a contradiction. Patriarchy is disputable, since fatherhood is a social construct, close quote. Number 6, motherer. There is often confusion about patriarchal hierarchization of genders and sexualities, which has always been considered fluid and dynamic in indigenous societies. Similarly, with notions of parenting, motherhood, fatherhood, kinship. None of the roles are rigid or exclusive. To transcend the myriad of issues around any biological essentialism of so-called mother, Genevieve Vaughan proposed the word motherer, so that anyone, irrespective of gender identities, can choose or be elected to be a motherer, to raise children. This is in line with many indigenous societies, especially across Africa and elsewhere, where the mother's brother, the uncle, raises the boy children or male-identified children, at times called a male mother. Indeed, Amadiomi uses the gender-neutral Igbo term ya, arguing in a groundbreaking 1987 book, Male Daughters, Female Husbands, that gender constructions as used by Western scholars and Western feminists were not known in Africa until the colonial enforcement of binary, hierarchical, patriarchal genders. Thus, the European and colonial imposition of gendered concepts such as male human being or humanity, e.g. the rights of man, and even male god, monotheistic patriarchal religions. Unlike the European he or she, Amadiomi contends that the Igbo ya means anyone without any gender. Its neutrality is another reminder of the fact that there are other ways to perceive the binary gendered concepts that Europeans impose, where the male pole is supervalued and the female undervalued, starting with the European and patriarchal highest representation of divinity as a male god. Quentin Atkinson has spoken about motherly or matriarchal men, and Evo Morales, for better or worse, from Bolivia, refers to himself as a so-called matriarchal man from an indigenous matriarchal peoples. In 2009, the Morales government in Bolivia established a full Ministry of Cultures, Decolonization, and Depatriarchalization, whose mission is to, and I'm quoting, decolonize and depatriarchalize, and to reverse this inequality between nationalities as well as between men and women. One can only dream of a similar full ministry in other countries. This ministry of the Morales era, it still exists to this day, thankfully. Progressive South African male Khoi leaders, indigenous leaders, similarly, some of them rematriate the matricentric. Now we're going to go to my 7 of 8 points, which is about the matricentric. Matricentric social structure and social values are interdependent. Egalitarianism and fluidities of all things are at its core. Social, gender, generational, sexualities, all ad infinitum. Patriarchal colonization ideologically imposed gendered hierarchies and biased beyond heteronormative sexualities. So too the notion of a male human being or humanity, such as the rights of man, as the center of the cosmos, and even a male god. Like the Dagara and many other indigenous peoples, the Kalahari San have female deities or dual gender deities. One Kalahari healer Ma Menaputo, describes her carefree childhood, hunting small animals like rabbits and young buck with a bow and arrow and making and playing with dolls. No Euroformed binary color-coded games for her. When she does healing circles, it is her lifelong male partner who holds a space for her, gently offering her water as she emerges from the trance state, a form of care that patriarchy inverts to have the domesticated enslaved wife care for her conqueror hero, Prince Patriarch. The Khoisan San have had renowned women leaders, as noted in the meticulous records of colonial administrators, referring to Indigenous leaders as captains, a rather lowly rank when compared with a more accurate analogy of general. Two respective communities of the Hessequa around the area of modern Swellendam in my Western Cape province were respectively led by a female leader, Lang Elsie or Tall Elsie, and encamped nearby a male leader, Noga Sari. The Bontebok National Park, where the Hessequa originally lived, named its rest camp after Lang Elsie. Still present today are solid stone wall remnants, not only of Lang Elsie's home, but also of the stone walls surrounding the community. Not only did the Hessequa live surrounded by abundant wildlife, including the Bontebok buck, after which the nature reserve is named, but they also had large stocks or kraals of sheep and cattle, the solid stone walls of which still stand in the park today. When the nature reserve was first established by European colonizers during the 1800s, after they decimated all the wildlife, they found Hessequa graves covered with, and I quote them, blue mountain stones. Still today, the Khoisan elect their leaders for fixed terms, and the current leader of the Kalahari is Katrina Isso. The South African government bestowed national orders on Ms. Isso and posthumously on her predecessor, David Kruger, during 2014, a ceremony I was privileged to be part of. Connected to all the above is love or compassion, compassion, feeling with, feeling for, akin to the African notion of Ubuntu. I am because I belong. I am because I care. To be compassionate, to love, one needs trust and respect. Love of self and all can be contrasted with patriarchal self-loathing and systemic distrust and hatred of all, seen, for example, in the proliferation of firearms and mass shootings, mostly perpetrated by patriarchal men. One needs women and all mothers of all varieties at the center of societies, co-creating social values and practices that are humane and non-violent, that nurture and foster individual and collective growth, that heal and care, that do no harm and definitely do not exploit. Interconnectedness and interdependence can be juxtaposed with psychotic patriarchal cleavages, separations, head from heart, top from bottom, the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, in René Descartes' work, versus an indigenous, I care and belong, therefore I am. Indigenous societies have compassionate spiritualities at their core, with feminine or dual-gender deities rather than a vengeful, raging patriarchal deity that inspires fear rather than love. There is a distinct contrast between the patriarchal power over and the matricentric egalitarian power as a resource to be shared in abundance and with respect, like every other resource. In Indigenous societies, there have been epic processes of societal evolution with complex ways of reinforcing egalitarianism, including laughter, literally laughing a foolish egocentric person, including myself, back into the collective, and humility. These are some of the basic elements of the Indigenous matricentric, which our burning planet is in desperate need of. My eighth and final point, it's called Trust Me, I'm Telling You Stories, making an example of Shostak on Nisa. Marjorie Shostak became a United States anthropologist without a doctorate, a woman who made her name, fame and fortune off the Kalahari Sound, and at least one Kalahari woman, whom she called Nisa. During the so-called gold rush of anthropology of the 1970s, and with only a bachelor or basic degree, Shostak accompanied her medical anthropologist husband, Melvin Connor, on an expedition to the Kalahari. While Connor was conducting his research, Shostak found company among the welcoming, generous Kalahari women, and Nisa in particular, from whom Shostak extracted immense knowledge but no wisdom. Shostak and Connor, without irony, also made a fortune off so-called their Paleolithic diet, drawing on the lifestyle and nutrition of the Kalahari San. Shostak wrote a groundbreaking book about Nisa, and in thanks gave Nisa 2 cows. Shostak then developed breast cancer and wanted Nisa to cure her cancer. She obtained generous sponsorship from a US pharmaceutical company, which funded her off-road vehicles, expensive equipment, and other research expenses. With global north pharmaceutical companies, one assumes indigenous plants and plant knowledge will be extracted for the profit of the corporations rather than the indigenous communities from where the ancient knowledge is derived. I am thinking here of foreign countries repeatedly trying to patent our indigenous rooibos or redbush tea, all the way to a court judgment protecting indigenous knowledge and assets. As gifts for Nisa, Shostak took some tea and beads, all meticulously recorded by Shostak in her best-selling second book. Shostak here reminds one of the colonizers at the Cape, trading beads and mirror shards for indigenous cattle and other valuable indigenous assets, meticulously and unconsciously perhaps recording the exploitation of the indigenous. A disappointed Shostak interrogates Nisa about the whereabouts of the 2 cattle previously gifted, which the starving Kalahari community slaughtered in the absence of other food. Nisa has meanwhile reached menopause and become a powerful shaman or healer. Her healing is always in service of, in context of, and in relation to her community. There are no pop star healers in the Kalahari who charge megabucks for services. Merely humble people going about their days doing the best they can for each other. On her second major trip to the Kalahari, generously funded by her pharmaceutical company sponsor, and in search of a cure for her breast cancer, Shostak complains about having to pay a nominal amount, especially in USD, to Nisa's relatives to drum for the spiritual celebration and healing ceremony, which Eurocentric anthropologists call a so-called trance dance. Shostak operates on assumptions firmly located in the exchange paradigm from which she hails. What's the most that I can get and profit for the least investment? Just like extractive capitalism. She gets books, funds, fame, fortune, all in exchange for a couple of cows, some tea and condensed milk, and a few beads. She even wants a cure for her own cancer. But she is too stingy, too mean-spirited to gift the healing ceremony drummers for their hard and spiritual work. Shostak eventually leaves the Kalahari, miserable and sick. She fails to receive or understand the message. She tragically dies of breast cancer at age 51 in 1996. Her husband and friends posthumously complete her second book on Nisa, and Shostak is hailed as an anthropological deity, an expert on the Kalahari San. A heart-rending story. In life, Shostak did not get the message. One wonders how many people who read her 2 books on Nisa, especially the second book, get the message. Meanwhile, Nisa has also been ill, and she eventually dies a very simple death, without fanfare, without posthumous publications, without material fortune. Date and cause of Nisa's death, unknown. One can simply contrast Nisa's relative happiness in a world of poverty as defined by the World Bank with the spiritual poverty that Shostak and her followers so poignantly, mindlessly represent. African-American feminist poet and spiritual warrior Audre Lorde also died of breast cancer. One of her famous teachings is that one cannot use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. Patriarchy and capitalism and the war industries will not be dismantled if we use patriarchal capitalist tools. One cannot stone Shostak for her mindless exploitation, or her entourage, including her husband and their collaborators and supporters. Instead, one feels devastated by their shameless behavior and inability to learn and heal in spirit and in body. One has compassion for Shostak, locating her in her environment. US academia, capitalism, patriarchy, and exploitation. Shostak simply knew no better. She could not learn or change. Indigenous compassion stems from complex technologies developed over centuries by indigenous peoples the world over. Indigenous knowledge written about and profitably exploited by scholars and charlatans around the world. In a groundbreaking essay on indigenous diplomacy, Leanne Simpson writes that Indigenous diplomacy is based on relationships, and she emphasizes the word relationships. Her paper is titled Politics Based on Justice, Diplomacy Based on Love, What Indigenous Diplomatic Traditions Can Teach Us. Simpson asserts that political and philosophical traditions emphasize good relationships with the natural world and with neighboring nations as the basis of good governance and a good life. She affirms that our politics, and I'm quoting her, our politics are embedded within our spirituality, making treaties a shared, sacred bond between peoples. They are a commitment to stand with each other, a responsibility to take care of shared lands, and an appreciation of each other's well-being. They are based on a profound mutual respect, and they are meant to be transformative. They transform conflict into peace by holding parties accountable for past injustices. They transform hardship into sustenance. They transform abuse of power into balanced relationships. Treaties and other Indigenous diplomatic traditions transform differing perspectives into, as the Haudenosaunee say, one mind, close quote. Unlike the Euroformed United Nations and Euroformed politics that is talk, talk, talk and less accomplishment, Simpson confirms that Indigenous diplomacy is not so much about dialogue, but about action and embodiment. Simpson speaks of peacemaking as diplomacy based on love, the love of land and the love of our people. And this alone has the power to transform Indigenous state relations into a relationship based on justice, respect, and responsibility. Thus, instead of hating Shostak or others, I firmly locate her exploitative, stubbornly ignorant, and mean-spirited behavior in the Euroformed society that she was socialized in. She knew no better. My compassion is uncomplex, indigenous, ancient, appropriate. In conclusion, and I spell it in-conclusion, for decades, Indigenous scholars and activists have wrestled with, among others, resistant mainstream feminists, elite feminists, deeply immersed in patriarchal institutions of the academy and donor funding, fearful of upsetting their careful positionalities and hard-won privileges within the patriarchy. We must continue to challenge the ways in which even the feminist mainstream centers the normative, for example, patriarchal abhorrence of the matricentric and gender and sexualities fluidities, as well as the ways in which other intersectionalities, such as socioeconomic class and education, are privileged and advanced in leading feminist circles, indeed peace circles too. Not only should we rematriate our historically divided Indigenous siblings, but so too, we should critically review our relationship with the majority of women everywhere. Betty Reardon's quotidian women, dispossessed by patriarchy and at times exploited for knowledge and experience by the academy, NGOs, and activists. The hitherto even unintentionally elitist feminisms should of necessity recenter the majority of women historically marginalized by intersectional oppressions. Liberation, justice, and peace, rather than transformation, will only be attained through concerted actions by and for the majority. Thus, even privileged African and Indigenous feminists, including I, should relinquish power to and work in solidarity with the majority of so-called ordinary women hitherto ignored, exploited, and abused. Women who must and will lead the struggles towards post-patriarchal egalitarianisms. Women including the Indigenous. In the words of Mamena Puto, the Kalahari San healer, the San people found power in the light of the moon. The ancients made a queen and hoisted her up into the sky, where she became the moon. The people danced in the light of the moon. This is where we find our healing power. May our moon inspire us to continue rematriation, a return to the martyr, the mother, the uterus, where beginning and end are all one, a return to Indigenous compassion, justice, and peace. If there is time, I have a very short poem called One and Many that I can share now. So I will just quickly read One and Many. Where the one in the many and the many in the one does not mean that one gets eclipsed or even destroyed by the many, as the liberals will have us believe. Each one and many are important components of the whole and beyond. Like the many colors that flow into a rainbow, like water into an ocean, one can see the rainbow and the individual colors that create the rainbow, inseparable and one. As one can see a drop of water and the infinity of oceans, one and many, in an infinite dance that defines the essence of humanity, of the world, of the cosmos. Thank you very much, Polly and Rauna.
Thank you, Bernadette, for a very powerful presentation, rigorous and rich in Indigenous knowledge. Given the time constraints we have, we're going to turn immediately to our next presenter, Rauna, and I will introduce her properly. Rauna Kuokkanen is a Sámi woman and research professor of Arctic Indigenous Studies at the University of Lapland, Finland, an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto. She is the author of 3 books, the most recent being the award-winning Restructuring Relations, Indigenous Self-Determination, Governance and Gender by Oxford University Press, which is an Indigenous feminist investigation of the theory and practice of Indigenous self-determination, governance, and gender regimes in Indigenous political institutions. Dr. Kuokkanen's research focuses on comparative Indigenous politics, Indigenous feminist theory, governance, law, and Nordic settler colonialism. Currently, she leads the Siida School project, a community-driven collaborative project by Sámi scholars, artists, and activists seeking to reclaim and reconstruct Sámi governance practices and principles for today's needs. And now I turn it over to Rauna.
Thank you very much, Polly. Vuori päivi, mulla on Jouna Jon Anne Kirste Rauna, mulla on ofsias Eeret ja täällä Ooron Raavinjarkas kiihtu ollut tämän konferenssin läide, kiitä Polly Poutijumis ja Bernadette Su saakkavuorus. Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on this panel. Thank you, Polly, for the very kind invitation, and Bernadette for your excellent introduction to rematriation and matricentric social structures. It's both an honor and delight to be on a panel of Indigenous women from 3 continents speaking on rematriation, just as we have just stepped into the new year. My talk draws on my most recent book that Polly mentioned, Indigenous Self-Determination, Governance and Gender, in which I challenge the opposition between self-determination, the Indigenous self-determination agenda, and gender issues, and argue that this opposition in fact stands in the way of implementing and realizing self-determination in Indigenous societies and communities. The comparative book is based on interviews with over 70 Indigenous people, mostly women and many grassroots from 3 regions, Greenland, Sámi, and Canada. And in Canada, I included 3 different regions. In my talk today, I'll focus on rematriating Indigenous governance, which was discussed most explicitly by Indigenous women participants in Canada. As a brief introduction to my talk, I want to say this. Implementing Indigenous self-determination can be an overwhelming undertaking, not only given the constraints of the legal and political straitjacket Indigenous peoples often find themselves with their signed self-government agreements and enacted legislation, but also because of the sheer scope of self-determination itself. The challenges typically lie in translating the political objectives into the nitty-gritty of taking over areas of jurisdiction. These in turn require systematic and detailed long-term planning and considerable amount of financial and human resources. With regard to implementing and exercising Indigenous self-determination, Greenland is a precedent-setting case in a number of ways. First, the Inuit of Greenland have arguably achieved the most extensive degree of Indigenous self-determination in the world. Second, it is significant that extensive self-determination has been achieved in a relatively short time, considering how many other regions, negotiations between states and Indigenous peoples for greater autonomy and self-government have been protracted for decades. Third, Greenland is unique among Indigenous peoples globally, for it has set its goal to become an independent country one day. At the other end of the spectrum is a situation where Indigenous political institutions are limited to self-administration and consultation with the states. This is the case in Sápmi, where in my home region, where the Sámi parliaments hold symbolic significance, but do not have jurisdiction over their own affairs. The implementation of self-determination in Sápmi is further complicated by the indeterminacy of the political discourse surrounding self-determination. The third dimension of Indigenous self-determination includes a vision of a complete overhaul of the existing structures and institutions, and a radically different way of governing Indigenous communities. This vision makes a case for the restoration and reclaiming the political roles and authority of Indigenous women alongside traditional governance structures and political orders, which I call rematriation, and which other scholars have also called rematriation. So in Canada, the participants, the people I talked to, I interviewed for my book, frequently discussed Indigenous women's political roles in the past, and many maintained that restoring these roles was a precondition for Indigenous self-determination and successfully implementing contemporary Indigenous governance. Deeply critical of Indigenous male leadership for their double standards and backburnering women's needs and concerns, Lee Maracle is among the first to raise the issue of restoration of women's political roles and call it as rematriation of Indigenous governance. For her, it makes no sense to proceed, quote, as though the rematriation of our governing structures were somehow separate and secondary to nation building, end of quote. Scholars have suggested that Indigenous self-determination endeavors and discourses are frequently shaped by and expressed within the framework of heteropatriarchal settler colonialism. Many existing self-government institutions are modeled after the logic and governance structures of the colonial state, instead of drawing and building on practices of diplomacy and systems of decision-making that Indigenous peoples have had in place in the past, and also those that Bernadette discussed a moment ago. In short, existing self-government arrangements serve as extensions of the colonial project. By internalizing the settler colonial logic, Indigenous self-determination struggles also often internalize and replicate the structures of racialized and gendered hierarchies and domination they claim to dismantle. As the result, there is a growing call for moral and political commitments by Indigenous leadership and others to restructure Indigenous governance structures in the way that reinstates the centrality of women. Importantly, as Maracle reminds us, reinstituting women's positions of power is an Indigenous feminist act that goes beyond the standard arguments of nationhood. And I quote her, "Rematriation and the restoration of our original systems would be a feminist activity rather than merely ensuring that existing governing systems are gender complementary." The mimicking and internalizing of the settler state logic and negotiating self-government agreements with the settler state colonial state is an ongoing concern for many Indigenous women, particularly in Canada and North America. Maracle bluntly argues that copying Western models and structures lack cultural integrity and cannot be considered self-government. And I quote her again. She says, "It is not self-governance to take up other nations' legal system and entrench it in our nations. There is not cultural integrity in guiding our actions based on external beliefs." Chauvinis from the West Coast points out the absurdity of mimicking models that have not proven to work. And she says, "Why are we copying something that's not working? We need to be aware and critically reflect how we are taking up things we learned from outside." End of quote. Other research participants stress the primacy of decolonization and indigenizing as the precondition for the implementation and exercise of self-determination. According to Kundok, in her English name, Jackie Green, too often the focus of self-government negotiations is on outside interests, such as those of the municipality or state, rather than asserting Indigenous autonomy within education, within social services, within our own politics. In her view, before even entering into negotiations, communities must internally figure out how indigeneity can be asserted in various areas of jurisdiction to be claimed by a community. As part of the internal process, questions about colonialism and its effects need to be addressed, including how do we unravel and unpack colonialism in our lives and in our communities. The internal dynamics of colonialism exist and materialize inside various structures, including bands, nations, communities, and organizations, and intersect with a range of external dynamics. The interplay of internal and external dynamics permeates our most intimate relations and are always gendered and often violent. Part of decolonization entails the identification and recognition of all forms of violence, including lateral violence. This implies, according to several participants, breaking away from the existing system and the various dependencies it has created. Sometimes it may mean just doing it, or recognition that we have to start doing things for ourselves. Restoring traditional governance structures as a bona fide way of implementing self-determination was indeed discussed by a number of participants. Although nearly everyone emphasized how each community is different, the suggestions of returning to clan governance systems and especially restoring the authority of clan mothers were strikingly similar. Discussing her Haisla community on the West Coast, Kundok noted how traditionally each clan always had male and female chiefs. And I quote her, "Historically, the way the leadership operated in my community is that there was always male and female chiefs in each clan, and it was up to them to provide the leadership to each clan." End of quote. This could be accomplished today, for example, by incorporating traditional hereditary leadership into the Indiana governance of chief and council, something that, according to Green, some communities are in the process of implementing. The common problem, however, is that the two systems remain unequal, with the chief and council system having more autonomy over the clan system. As discussed by a number of participants, patriarchy stands in the way of Indigenous self-determination. Therefore, in the words of one woman, quote, "We can't chart a path forward if we are working with the same old boys club type of mentality." This mentality manifests in numerous ways, one being resistance to and fear of female leadership and power sharing by current male leaders. Lee Maracle recounts how she suggested a leadership model consisting of a female and male chief for the Assembly of First Nations after its 2003 elections. Maracle's suggestion was not seriously entertained, however, in spite of its transformative potential for Indigenous political organizations. Wanda Nanibush sees the same problem in the ongoing Anishinaabeg Nation Restoration of Jurisdiction initiative, a process of negotiating with federal and provincial governments to rebuild traditional governance and restore jurisdiction in a number of areas, such as governance and education. The restoration of jurisdiction, in her view, as it is currently structured, is still a top-down process. For Nanibush, in order to eliminate existing hierarchies of domination and ultimately for Anishinaabe jurisdiction to make sense, the entire structure needs to be transformed by returning to the clan system and returning to the power that women held. There are Indigenous communities where the system of clan mothers still exists, such as the Six Nations of the Grand River in southern Ontario, although informally and in a compromised manner. The traditional form of governance at Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy, involving hereditary chiefs and clan mothers, was forcibly removed by gunpoint in 1924 by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and followed by the institution of the Indian Band Council system. The Confederacy governance went underground, and while its existence was denied by the state, it continued operating in addition to the Band Council. Recently, the Six Nations has witnessed a resurgence of the Confederacy governance, clan mothers, and their authority in community affairs, connected to the 2006 reclamation and occupation of the construction site in Caledonia, or Canostaton, Ontario, southern Ontario. Yvonne Hill, a Mohawk clan mother who played a central role at the reclamation, notes, "It was the clan mothers at the site that made the decision to stay there when the Band Council chief had ordered people to leave. At the height of the occupation, people involved in the reclamation looked to the women, especially to the clan mothers, for guidance who set the ground rules for a peaceful protest." One of the strongest cases for reinstating the political roles of women has been made by Oneida scholar Robert Porter. He suggests that the Seneca Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, situated in the New York State, has been troubled by the disruption of the traditional method of checks and balances, the concentration of political power in the hands of only a few men, and the failure to address critical issues facing the Seneca people. According to Porter, The legitimacy of Seneca governance and sovereignty can be restored only by reinstating the political roles of women, clan and family decision-making and participation structures. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is constituted of the Grand Council, made up of 50 chiefs or royaneh selected by clan mothers. The royaneh are all men, but are selected by the women from his nation whose family holds the particular title. Clan mothers also remove chiefs from their positions had they failed to serve their people. If and when the chiefs neglect to heed clan mothers' advice, both the men and women of the Confederacy would meet in their own separate councils to discuss the matter and give notice and warnings to the royaneh to take corrective action. This structure of governance was radically undermined by a series of events, starting from the American Revolutionary War. Other influences included Handsome Lake and his assimilationist gospel that replaced extended family relations with a nuclear family ideal and transformed gender roles, and the adoption of the Seneca Constitution in 1848, which made no provision for women to vote or hold office. The transformation from matrilineal kinship relations to patrilineal nuclear family structure happened within a generation, radically undermining women's previously held political and economic authority. For Porter to suggest the restoration of women's and clans' political roles is not idealizing women's roles or theorizing in the abstract, but something urgently needed in order to address major problems affecting the Seneca people. According to him, these problems include the destruction of ecosystems by extensive logging, growing socioeconomic inequalities created by laissez-faire capitalism, elimination of treaty rights, inadequate administration, and dying Seneca language and culture. Although Seneca women have been able to vote since 1964 and hold office in their nations since 1966, these political rights do not amount to restoration of gender-based political roles. Notably, Porter submits that the ideal of equal, that is, same rights to political participation, does not necessarily square off with the Seneca nation's unique historic gender-based decision-making in which women were politically equal with men, but in which the political roles were clearly differentiated along the gender lines. He suggests, and I quote him, restricting and channeling the power associated with intragender politicking by allowing the power of each gender group to develop consensus on its own in its own way may have been a key to collective strength in the pre-colonial Seneca decision-making process. End of quote. In order to restore the legitimacy of the Seneca governance would require in part reinstatement of political roles on the basis of gender, even if it meant some degree of gender segregation. Porter concludes his analysis by pointing out that the Haudenosaunee governance structure based on Gaya Nashagowa, or the Great Law of Peace, worked for one important reason. It promoted peace by ensuring that all members of Haudenosaunee society had a say in the governmental process. Although the system of clan mothers and hereditary chiefs in this way that I just spoke is unique to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and could not be copied or adopted as such by others, its basic premises of political decision-making would serve well all Indigenous governance structures, that is, promoting peace by ensuring everyone's involvement, and that serious political ramifications would follow for overlooking or ignoring concerns and views of a segment of a society. Such checks and balances rarely exist in contemporary Indigenous self-government structures, yet there was near unanimity among all the participants that this is what fundamentally holds implementing Indigenous self-government back. Importantly, reinstating the political roles and authority of Indigenous women, which I call rematriation, goes beyond the usual calls for equal opportunities or equal political participation for women to re-establish a system that would guarantee in practice that women's concerns and needs are not backburnered in all decision-making. It takes different forms for different people, but has the common ground of being informed by a rejection of the ongoing violence of the colonial state, which self-government also represents, and the recognition-based approaches to Indigenous self-determination. In short, rematriation rejects self-government politics as usual, typically driven by male agendas and structured by and for the state. Some scholars are critical of references to matriarchies. They claim that Indigenous matriarchies as, quote, a world in which women are the centers of the universe, controlling all power and resources, end of quote, are fantasies based on romanticized and idealized versions of Indigenous polities, especially the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, popularized by early Indigenous feminist authors such as Paula Allen. For others, employing the term matriarch in reference to Indigenous conceptions of gender and power is unfounded because it reinforces the colonial gender binary, anthropological interpretations of Indigenous social order, and authoritarian power. I acknowledge the importance of these criticisms because they highlight some of the problematic aspects of interpreting the concept through a narrow lens of reversal of heteropatriarchal gender binary. Yet the fact that in many Indigenous societies, women engaged in hunting and still do, in hunting, fishing, diplomacy, leadership, warfare, and domestic tasks, does not negate the existence of matrilineal or matriarchal societies, either in the Indigenous or non-Indigenous world. Further, the suggestion that the term matriarch in reference to Indigenous conceptions of gender and power reinforces authoritarian power is unsubstantiated. As scholars of matriarchal societies have noted, matriarchies are neither mere reversals of patriarchy, nor they privilege one gender over others, as we just heard Bernadette discussing. They are mother-centered, starting from and including the Mother Earth, societies, in that they are matrilineal and foreground values of egalitarianism, peace, as well as caretaking and nurturing of all relations that extend to the animal nations, the land, and so on. Egalitarianism in matriarchies does not imply mainstream gender equality of eliminating differences between genders. Instead, the dignity and integrity of all genders is recognized without establishing hierarchies between them. Thus, the concept of matriarchy critiques narrow anthropological interpretations of Indigenous matrilineal societies and refuses the heteropatriarchy of settler colonialism and its hierarchical gender binaries. Moreover, matriarchal societies challenge the Western feminist objective of equal opportunity and rights to political participation, while engaging in radically different political practices of gender-based decision-making that promote peace by ensuring everybody's participation and recognizing everybody's contribution. Recognizing the dignity and integrity of all genders is the foundation of individual self-determination, as I discuss in my book. This includes sexual self-determination, meaning the ability to choose how to identify one's experience, sovereignty over one's body, and respect for the decisions a person makes over their own lives today. Rematriation as a transformative process takes this critique further by reclaiming the concept from misinterpretations and putting the idea of Indigenous egalitarianism into practice in today's setting and contemporary governance. So this idea of matriation and Indigenous egalitarianism foregrounding the dignity and integrity of all genders is predicated on non-domination of all relations. And this requires eliminating the regulation of Indigenous gender relations that in many ways has been at the heart of the colonial project, with the objective of controlling the political authority of specifically Indigenous women, as well as the two-spirit queer people. This has taken place through the control of sexual agency, because this agency is seen as a threat to heteropatriarchy, the heteronormative nuclear family, and the replication and reproduction of queer indigeneity and Indigenous political orders. The hierarchy colonialism needs to operate and ultimately Indigenous freedom. The challenge and strategy of rematriation is therefore to exceed the existing heteropatriarchal gender binary, because as long as that remains in place, it operates as the discursive mechanism of oppression in which gender relations are discursively articulated in whatever ways are useful to the colonial enterprise. Through Indigenous egalitarianism and eliminating the regulation of Indigenous gender relations, rematriating Indigenous governance has the potential of normalizing and centering also Indigenous queerness. Importantly, centering Indigenous queerness cannot be a mere token recognition of or inclusion of queer individuals in straight Indigenous spaces. Even if existing matriarchal societies may not adequately center and involve two-spirit and queer people, it must be the foundation of rematriation of Indigenous governance. That is ultimately needed if the objective of Indigenous self-determination is indeed the non-domination of all people, all relations. As Dana L. Wesley argues, taking the idea that we are all related seriously requires strengthening all those relationships, including two-spirit queer individuals. And I quote her, "If Indigenous people want to have real conversations about nationhood, then there have to be serious efforts made to foster relationships between two-spirit people and wider Indigenous communities beyond lip service. Creating real connections with two-spirit people means asking them what matters to them in relation to nation building." End of quote. Indigenous nation building and self-determination will not be transformative if they replicate the erasure of two-spirit, trans and queer Indigenous individuals. Rematriation needs to be about embracing the fact that traditionally queer identity has often been so normal in society that they have not necessarily been specific words or terminology for it. Centering Indigenous queerness is about accepting and honoring all gender expressions and creating spaces where all Indigenous bodies are celebrated and where none are violated. Rematriation premised on such Indigenous egalitarianism poses a considerable challenge for governance. First, it is a radical challenge, for it calls into question the very structures of political institutions, mainstream and those Indigenous ones modeled after them. As I discuss in my book, many existing Indigenous political institutions are characterized by deep and troubling gender regimes that no matter how many women you add to the system, numbers alone will not change them. This is why Indigenous egalitarianism necessarily transcends the standard mainstream approach of equal rights or equality of opportunity to political participation. The second challenge rematriation poses for governance is that it requires no less than overhauling the way in which contemporary Indigenous political institutions are conceptualized, established, and operated. Mohawk leader Ellen Gabriel argues that the restoration of Indigenous women's political roles requires, above all, dismantling the oppressive system that does not work. She does not advocate returning to longhouses, but rather calls for finding and creating ways of living the great law of peace in contemporary society. What is more, it's important to bear in mind that rematriation is not a form of governance per se, but a deliberate process of reclaiming or instituting in places where pre-existing systems do not exist, of women's political authority and roles, which also recognizes and heeds the need to simultaneously reinstate clan and family decision-making and participation structures. Also notably, whatever shape rematriated systems would take will need to pay close and continuous attention to institutional relations of domination. Every system will need to establish their own method of checks and balances to ensure everyone's participation and avoid replicating heteropatriarchal hierarchies and structures of power. In the Seneca Nation, for example, the key to collective strength in the decision-making process was the distinguishing of political roles along gender lines, but only as long as all genders were politically equal. Necessarily, in any contemporary system, all genders would need to be embraced as equally important and the colonial gender binary rejected and eliminated. No question, any rematriation process would face many of the same challenges as any other Indigenous governance system. Indigenous political difference elicits fear in the colonial state and non-Indigenous public resulting in backlash and fierce opposition in the mainstream and even state intervention. This is perhaps most obvious in the case of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose assertions of sovereignty and attempts to reclaim space for the Confederacy Council have been met with a major police response in a number of occasions since the council was removed from office by force in 1924. Other common strategies of denial and undermining Indigenous political authority include smear campaigns in mainstream media seeking to create suspicion and mistrust in the public. There is also a practical challenge of exercising traditional governance protocols such as decision-making and consultation in the clan system in a way that are considered legitimate and commensurate to the existing standards and expectations of accountability and transparency by the Indigenous community. Another considerable complication is the perpetual pressure of extractive industries on Indigenous territories faced by all Indigenous governments and communities. The difference to the standard approach of consultation, access, and benefit sharing arrangements, however, lies in the way in which decisions about economic development would be made in a rematriated political order. Most importantly, the political structure would ensure everyone's involvement in the process leading to the decision. The structure would be designed in a way that if decisions by those in charge of decision-making, whether men, women, or two-spirit queer, were not acceptable to the entire community, those decision makers would be promptly removed from office. Second, if self-determination is perceived as a value, this is what I suggest in my book, and what I mean by it is that as a value, it's a widely shared understanding of what a group considers indispensable for their well-being. So I argue that self-determination for Indigenous people is a foundational right, but it's also fundamental collective value. So if it's perceived as a value, self-determination, attained through the norm of integrity, the collective deliberative process leading to a decision would be closely heed to the norm of integrity, both territorial and individual, in all considerations and at all times. In such a system, decision-making process regarding complex issues such as economic development would not by any means be any easier, and possibly it would be even more difficult, given the necessity and complexity of everyone's involvement. At the very least, however, it would not be an old boys club making decisions behind closed doors while the rest of the community finds out about them through the media, which unfortunately is sometimes the case. So to conclude very briefly, I conclude the book discussing how rematriation is also part of Indigenous gender justice. And I argue in my book that one of the foundational dimensions of rematriation and Indigenous gender justice is the dismantling of the binary opposition and the conceptual hierarchy of gender and self-determination, the idea with which I started the talk. So I suggest that this is the core aspect that needs to be deconstructed and restructured in order for Indigenous gender justice and ultimately also Indigenous self-determination to take place. It may not mean literally rematriating Indigenous governance, simply because Indigenous women's political and leadership roles were not historically identical in all Indigenous societies, not even in the regions examined in my book. For example, there's ample evidence and research on Indigenous women's political authority and leadership in many Indigenous nations in North America, to which Polly also referred to in the beginning. There's no equivalent data available, for example, from Sámi or Greenland. So I suggest that then that in those Indigenous societies where Indigenous women did not historically hold high political positions, or there is no specific information available about women's roles, rematriating Indigenous governance nonetheless serves as a provocative euphemism for some I argue three critical aspects of restructuring gendered conceptual and political divisions between, on the one hand, self-determination issues and on the other hand, women's issues. And one of them is rematriation. sorry, I mean like the idea of rematriating as a provocative euphemism is, if I summarize very briefly, one is the recognition of the diverse informal ways of participation of Indigenous nation building and self-determination efforts and endeavors. These are often ways that are not typically considered as political through and by formal institutional structures. Like many Indigenous women talked about raising and educating children, choosing to speak the Indigenous language to them, engaging in direct action, running community programs. These are all part of nation building that we often do not recognize them as such. And the second aspect is that ensuring Indigenous women's full participation and representation in formal politics in ways that does not only amount to a limited approach of non-discrimination. So it's not just a matter of inserting women and hoping they adopt and survive the male political structures, but it entails that an understanding of the operation of gender regimes in those institutions, first and foremost, and a willingness to and commitment to transform and restructure those existing political systems in ways that address these gendered structures, and people are aware of these existing gendered structures. And finally, the commitment to transform and restructure existing Indigenous political systems must necessarily imply the interrogation of heteronormativity and heteropatriarchy in those institutions and Indigenous societies in general, which is the third and final aspect of rematriating Indigenous political systems. Kiitos Ollu, thank you for listening.
Rauna, thank you very much. I can imagine us sitting in Kenya to a thunderous round of applause for your excellent and very comprehensive presentation. And I want to be very respectful of both of your time. So I'm looking at 20 after the hour. I know we're all on different hours. Do you have time for a brief dialogue amongst us, or would you like for us to wrap it up here?
Rauna?
It's 20 past. I think I need to go. I'm sorry for family reasons. It's late afternoon here.
So let me wrap this up. I want to thank both of you deeply. I'm very grateful for your sharing knowledge, both from your professional and academic expertise, but from the very strong ties that you've established with Indigenous women and Indigenous communities around the world. And I want to say that for me, that your work means that our women's hearts are not on the grounds and that our Indigenous nations are thriving. So thank you very deeply, and I look forward to reading more of your work.
Thank you very much, Polly, for making this panel happen and for chairing it. Thank you so much. And thank you, Bernadette, for your talk.
Thank you both, and thank you, Polly, for taking the Indigenous rights and women's rights issues forward and rematriating these in peace and justice and in IPRA in particular. We'll be in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye.